My wife cheated on me with my own younger brother, and I found out that the child was not mine, and all because I inherited 3.2 million. My sibling made my existence a nightmare, and later I discovered he got my wife expecting, and our child wasn't mine. Now he's attempting to re-enter my life after our parents renounced him and left me their 3.2 million legacy. I have a younger brother named Kyle who has loathed me for as long as I can recall. If you're thinking it was due to envy, you would be mistaken. I was not the preferred child VJ he was. Let me provide you some background. My mom always indulged my younger sibling. He was the golden boy in our family. Mom would prepare his meals, do his laundry, and even ask me to assist him with his schoolwork. I was expected to help just because he was family, but this favor was never returned to me. I came to accept it as I was quite self-sufficient, perhaps partly my fault for accommodating his demands without expecting anything in return. He never assisted me when I needed it, and only reached out when he required something from me. I was a quiet, introverted child who enjoyed studying and keeping to myself, while he was exactly like our dad VDJJ, boisterous and loud. I also tend to be direct and honest, not sugarcoating things. I believe my mother might have developed a negative view of me due to my honesty. Consequently, Kyle was everyone VJTM's favorite in our family. I didn't VDJT mind this while we were growing up. The trouble began when he found ways to torment me or ridicule me for being different from him. He would tease me about my height or the fact that I wore glasses. He would sneak into my room and try to read my diary, then report anything I had written to my mom. I would yell at him and complain to my parents about him violating my privacy, but they would laugh it off, telling me it wasn't a big deal. He did more terrible things, like nearly breaking my glasses and putting disgusting things in my food. Once he even put small stones in my cereal, but fortunately, I found them before they could damage my teeth. I told my mom, but she dismissed it, saying that VDJTM is how brothers bond. Every time we argued, Kyle would insult me, focusing on all my insecurities. We attended the same school, so he knew I was being bullied by a couple of kids. Instead of supporting me, he would join them in calling me names like loser or nerd, and encourage the bullies to physically harm me because, according to him, I was just a big failure. One time we had an argument about something trivial, and at the end of the fight he told me to end my life. Other insults I could ignore, but that one really hurt because I was struggling with my mental health at the time. IVJTMM doing better now, but it was painful to hear that my own brother wanted me to die. Since Dad was often at work and Mom didn't VJTMT seem to care much VJ, she even scolded me once, claiming it was my fault for playing and annoying him. VJ things got progressively worse. Once he tried to burn my hair when we were in high school, and shockingly, Mom sided with him, insisting he was just playing. Fortunately, Dad eventually took my side and pointed out that there were serious problems. He threatened to call the authorities on Kyle. This was an eye-opening moment for my brother because until then, he had never been reprimanded for any of his actions. He was taken aback, and Dad continued to tell him how enough was enough and that he needed to start respecting his older sibling. Later, Dad came into my room and talked to me. I had never expected my dad to support me, because he always told Kyle while he was growing up how similar both of them were, which was true. Dad told me that he had patiently waited for years for Kyle to mature, thinking maybe he was just being an immature kid, but he was slowly starting to realize that Kyle was becoming a big bully. When I heard my dad say this, I felt so validated that I almost broke down in tears. I confessed to my dad everything that Kyle had done to me over the years and even opened up about the bullying in school. My dad was shocked that I was going through so much. The next day, he went and talked to the principal so my bullies could be warned about severe consequences if they continued. Later in the evening, my dad enrolled me in MMA at our local gym. He told me that I needed to toughen up and stand up to bullies in my life. I will admit that a nerdy kid like me trying to learn to fight must have been laughable to watch. However, like everything in my life, I am very focused when I want to learn something. I carved out time for my studies so I could work out every day and go to MMA classes. Not to boast, but it completely changed my life and my physique. One day, Kyle was at it again. He had stolen my pocket money, which we used to get if we helped our parents with chores. I had been saving my money for quite some time. Kyle had sneaked into my room and taken my money. I caught him when he was about to cycle off with his friends. I firmly told him to give me back my money since he knew stealing was wrong, but Kyle snickered and taunted that all I could do was run to Daddy for help. I don't know what came over me, but I gave Kyle a resounding punch to his face. He was stunned in silence as he fell backward on the ground. I picked him up, took out my money from his trouser pocket, and then threw him back down on the ground. Kyle started to cry loudly like a little baby. It was comical to see a teenage boy crying on the ground. However, my mother came running out the door, hearing her baby boy, to help him up and find out what had happened. Even Dad was not supporting his antics. For the first time in a long time, I felt we were equals. Even though he could not physically hurt me, he would try to verbally say nasty things to me when he knew our parents would not be around. It definitely got worse as he got older. It felt like each year he became angrier and had a shorter fuse. If I approached him to ask something, he would simply ignore me to my face and walk away out of the room, calling me a nerd or a loser under his breath if he wanted to say something to me. He would only go through our mother, who would relay the message. I would question my mother as to why Kyle could not just talk to me if he wanted something, and she would implore me to be more understanding. I had no clue if this was just him going through adolescence, and I had to wait it out, or if he actually truly hated me. I used to be able to deal with the things he would say over the years, but it got to a point where I just wanted to move out of home to get away from him. I would go to my mother countless times asking if she could mediate a sit-down conversation for all of us to talk it out, but she always refused, saying she didn't want to get involved. I even asked for her opinion on why he treated me that way, but she would just brush off the question. Eventually, I went away to my dream university since I was a top student and was even qualified for a scholarship. My dad threw a party for me, and my mom seemed proud of me also. However, Kyle remained aloof and distant, barely acknowledging my achievements. The day I left for university was a mix of excitement for the future and relief to escape the toxic environment at home. The first few months at the university were liberating. I made new friends, enjoyed my classes, and started to build a life separate from the oppressive atmosphere I had experienced growing up. The constant fear of Kyle's verbal attacks lifted, and I felt a newfound sense of peace. I began dating my wife Karen when we were both in the second year of university. My friend introduced us at a fraternity party, and we clicked right away. Coming from a religious family, having kids without being married was a big no-no. However, we found out she was pregnant when we were in the final year of university, which prompted us to get married as soon as we graduated. Our wedding was a small but peaceful ceremony. Our parents were happy for us, and we had a good time at our wedding. At that moment, I believed she was the love of my life. I always held the mindset that I wanted monogamy in life, one woman to come home to and be with for the long haul. Despite women trying to engage with me over the years, I never pursued anything because I was genuinely content in my marriage. Karen was my dream girl, and I never wanted to hurt her. However, over the years, there were 2 occasions when I discovered she was being unfaithful in our marriage. One was an on-and-off affair that lasted a few years with her married co-worker, and the other was a fling with an ex she had dated in high school when she went to visit her family states away. I'm sure there will be people who might call me foolish, and looking back, I can't really deny it myself. After a period of separation in both situations, I made the decision to forgive my wife. I never wanted to raise my child in a broken home, and I genuinely believed we could overcome these challenges. We were quite young when the situation with her co-worker occurred, so I chalked it up to youthful mistakes and not thinking things through. For a while, things seemed okay with us. I could never fully trust her, but I tried my best to push aside my doubts because I knew that if I chose to forgive her, I had to work towards moving past it and starting with a clean slate. It's been 5 years since the second time she was unfaithful, and I felt like I made the right decision by giving her a chance to show that she still wanted to be in our marriage. For years, Karen seemed to have changed, and we were genuinely happy with plans set in motion for the future of our family. However, 4 months ago, my reality was once again shattered by yet another incident, which in my mind was far worse than the others, when she revealed that she had been sleeping with someone for quite some time, and suggested that our son might not even be mine. Hearing her words, I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. A mix of shock, betrayal, and disbelief overwhelmed me. I struggled to comprehend the enormity of what she had just disclosed. In a daze, I managed to ask her why she had kept such a significant secret and how she could have done something so devastating. Her reaction was cold and indifferent. She seemed detached, almost unbothered by the pain she had inflicted. Her responses were vague, leaving me with more questions than answers. It was a surreal and painful moment, confronting the shattered trust and the uncertainties about my own family. I continued to ask Karen to tell me the truth, because I felt like I deserved to know the father of the child since I had been raising our son from the beginning. In the end, she admitted that it was Kyle. My eyes widened in shock as I asked her what exactly she meant by that. This is when Karen told me how she and Kyle had become friends back when I had introduced Karen to my family, and she had stayed with us for Thanksgiving up until New Year's. I remember Kyle, who was usually cold to me, was quite polite and warm towards her. I was glad since I did not want to make Karen feel unwelcome. She wanted to be accepted into my family, so she would spend significant time hanging out with my mom whenever she could. She noticed that Kyle and I were not that close and questioned me about it. I finally opened up to her about my childhood relationship with Kyle and told her how we might never be able to repair our relationship since he never could move past his feelings. Karen understood. However, she started to include Kyle whenever we would go out, perhaps hoping that both of us would warm up to each other. If we were going to watch a movie, she would invite Kyle, and then we would have to watch whatever movie Kyle wanted to watch. I guess during this time, Kyle and I did talk a few words here and there, which was a significant improvement compared to how he had been giving me the silent treatment for years. I do remember Karen and Kyle would hang out and play video games together, but I never thought much about it. Karen told me how one day Kyle opened up to her about his struggles and his recent breakup with his then ex-girlfriend. He seemed so vulnerable with her, and they struck up a friendship. She said how he would sometimes harmlessly flirt with her when I was not around, and apparently, one thing led to another, and she could not control herself anymore. I closed my eyes as the vision of my wife and brother sleeping together almost made me puke. She told me how guilty she felt after that and ran away from him. After that, she decided to go back home, which was true because my girlfriend had abruptly told me how she wanted to go back home when I thought she would be spending New Year's with me. I tried to convince her to stay, but she was adamant that she had to go after the holidays. When we met in college, once our classes resumed, she was back to her usual cheerful self, so I never questioned anything. 2 weeks after that, we found out that she was pregnant. Now Karen told me that she had no idea whether it was really my child or Kyle's, and she had no way to find proof, because I was already stepping up. She knew out of the two I was the more dependable brother, so she decided to stay with me. And this is why we got married. I felt like my whole world was crashing down around me. The son I had loved and spent countless hours with may not even be mine. I questioned her if she had been sleeping with Kyle in the present times, and she nodded slowly. Karen told me how she and Kyle had always stayed in touch because their chemistry was undeniable. They would sneak off to hotels when she would lie to me that she was working overtime. She told me how half of her business trips were just romantic getaways with him. I asked Karen why she would even be married to me if she really wanted my brother, but Karen told me how she did not want to be the one to break off a marriage, and seeing how I was such a wonderful father to our son, she had stayed with me all this while. In her words, she had made a mistake, and she didn't know when to stop. I simply told Karen that I was glad that she told me the truth and that I was going to pack up and move out. Karen started to cry and ask for my forgiveness, telling me how I was supposed to scream and yell at her, but here I was calmly thinking of my next move. I remained quiet while I walked to my cupboard and started packing some of my clothes into my suitcase. Karen kept saying how if I really loved her, then I should try to at least fight for her, and that mistakes happen in every marriage. When she realized that I was not going to do anything, she changed her tactic and told me how my son would be affected if we got a divorce, and how children should not be brought up in a broken home. I reminded her how I may not even be the father, which then reduced her to tears, and she started to yell at me about being cruel, and how I could easily walk away when I had been there for the child since his birth. It seemed like my wife believed there was nothing that could make me want out of our marriage. I guess it was partly my fault for letting a lot slide in the past. While I did have some love for her, It felt more like it stemmed from the fact that I thought we had a son together and had been together since college. Karen continued to claim that it was not too late and that we could work things out, but I struggled to believe it and felt like I had no more patience to deal with her. Trust was a major issue for me, and her words felt empty. Even if I forgave her, I could never forget that she had slept with my own brother. I've always believed that people could make mistakes and be forgiven because we're all flawed, but this went beyond a certain limit. I left her crying on the doorstep and checked into a hotel. The next day, I went straight to my parents and told them everything about my wife's affair with Kyle and how they had been sleeping together for years behind our backs. The shock on their faces was evident. My mother, true to her nature, initially tried to defend Kyle, telling me that this could not be true since her boy could never do something like this to his own brother. Determined to expose the truth, I requested my parents to remain silent and allow me to call Kyle right in front of them. I told them not to make a sound since this is how I could expose Kyle's true colors. I wanted him to think that it was just a private conversation between us so that he could hopefully let his guard down. As Kyle picked up, I laid it onto him and confronted him with the revelation of his affair with my wife. Initially, he denied it vehemently and refused to accept it. Then, when I told him that Karen had admitted to everything, he started to blame Karen, labeling her as characterless. He told me that it was not his fault if women were attracted to him and that he was the better-looking brother. I told him firmly that I was going to expose him in front of everyone. When Kyle mocked that no one would believe me and that he was the golden child anyway, I scoffed at his arrogance and thanked him for confirming the truth, since our parents had heard everything. Kyle went quiet and then spluttered to explain himself, stumbling over his words in an attempt to salvage his image. My mother, still grappling with shock, demanded an explanation from Kyle. He stuttered through a feeble attempt to justify his actions, blaming everyone else but himself, and desperately trying to shift the blame onto Karen. I could see my mother, who was once protective of her favored son, now felt a mix of disappointment and anger. In that charged moment, I felt a strange sense of vindication. For years, I had endured Kyle's torment. Now the truth had come to light, and the roles were reversed. It was Kyle who stood exposed, his actions laid bare for everyone to see. As Kyle's words faltered, my father, usually reserved in his expressions, couldn't contain his disappointment. He asked me to pass him the phone and went off on him. "Kyle," he began, his tone heavy with disapproval, "what you've done is not just a betrayal of your brother, but a betrayal of this family. You slept with your brother's wife and continued even after they got married. Your actions have consequences, and they have irreversibly damaged the trust we had in you. I raised both of you to value family loyalty and decency. What you've shown today goes against everything I've tried to instill in you." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle on Kyle's conscience. "The disregard for your brother's feelings, the lack of respect for the sanctity of his marriage, VGJ, it's unacceptable. You've not only hurt him, but tarnished the bonds that hold us together as a family. I feel like your mom and I are to be blamed for what you have become, and we will no longer let you get away with this behavior. Starting today, I am cutting you off from the college funds that I set up for you. You can figure out on your own about your university fees. I will also not be funding your lifestyle anymore. You think it makes you more of a man to sleep with married women? Well, now let's see what happens to you when you don't have my money to depend on." I, on the other hand, maintained a composed demeanor throughout all this. Although I initially wanted to scream at Kyle, watching my dad punish him was the ultimate vindication. I had exposed his true nature, and it was clear that he had underestimated the consequences. Kyle, persistent in his protests, continued to justify himself, but my father swiftly ended the call, shutting down Kyle's attempts to explain away his actions. My mom came up to me and hugged me. It had been a while since we shared such a moment, but in that embrace, there was unspoken understanding and support amid the family turmoil. She apologized to me for not believing me all this time. I felt like my 14-year-old self would never have imagined this moment, VGJ being vindicated and embraced by my mother. After that, my dad helped me find a good lawyer so I could divorce Karen. She and her lawyer tried to fight dirty by asking me for alimony since I earned more than her, but luckily, her affair played heavily in my favor. We also had a paternity test for my son, and it was determined that Kyle was indeed the father of the child. I can't begin to describe how painful it was for me to digest this news. It was worse than when Karen told me that she had been cheating on me. I felt so enraged that my son didn't belong to me. However, I guess God works in mysterious ways because I decided to stay strong throughout all this. Karen begged me that I should keep visiting my son since he should not be punished for all this, but I just could not bear to see him. He reminded me of Kyle, and I hated it. After my divorce was finalized and I was finally free, I moved into my own bachelor pad. It felt surreal living on my own since I had got married so young and never really lived on my own. However, since I had always been independent, I was quick to adapt to my bachelor lifestyle, and I honestly loved it. 2 weeks ago, my dad called me to let me know that he had been thinking of changing his will since he didn't want to give Kyle anything. If there's one thing to know about my dad, it is that he is extremely resolute. Since he had made up his mind that he wanted nothing to do with Kyle, he kept his word. Kyle tried to reach out to our parents and even showed up at their doorstep begging them for forgiveness, but he was not even allowed inside. My mother, who usually caves into Kyle's tantrums, also seemed to be done with him, although it must have hurt her the most throughout all this. Kyle didn't even once send me a text to apologize for what he had done, so clearly he didn't even regret it. He was just sad about being cut off from our parents. Dad told me that he would be leaving everything to me just to ensure that Kyle doesn't protest later. He would be leaving him with only $1. My eyes widened in shock as my dad had worked really hard his whole life, including his assets, retirement fund, and life insurance. It would come up to almost $3 million. The only clause in his will was that if my dad passed away before my mom, she would continue to live in their house, even though the ownership would go to my name. Of course, I didn't mind this since I would want to take care of my mom until her last days. I don't know how, but Kyle found out about all this, and since he can't reach my parents, he called me yesterday trying to mend things between us. He told me how he had been having trouble keeping up with college, and that after Karen had found out about the paternity of the child, she had been pestering him about child support. He told me that he had no money and was looking for part-time jobs, yet could not find anything. He begged me to talk to our family so we could start fresh since he really needed my help. I started to laugh in his face and told him that I was done with him and that he should have thought about all this before sleeping with my wife and getting her pregnant. Kyle started to argue that I was being unfair and that she was to blame also, to which I agreed and reminded him how I did divorce her and now she was his responsibility, so he should not be calling me complaining about her or her child since this was the consequence of his own actions. Kyle started to raise his voice, but I cut him off and reminded him that he was no longer the favored child in the family, but the black sheep who slept with his own brother's wife. Kyle started to cry at this point and told me how everyone had turned against him, including our grandparents and relatives, which was true, but this was no longer my concern. I told him that we were done and to never call me again since I was no longer his brother. Since then, I have been replaying the conversation over and over in my head. Although I hate my brother, I had never heard him cry, at least not since we grew up. I won't lie, but it did hurt me a bit that he was this helpless. So I guess I'm here to ask if I should talk to our parents about him, or would I be in the wrong if I don't? Update. Hi everyone. A lot of you have been asking me as to why I am no longer in contact with my son Henry, and some of you have also called me cruel. Well, I am sorry to say this, but I don't feel comfortable raising another man's child. This is not a stepson scenario. In this case, I was led to believe that he was my son, and then I discovered that he was, in fact, my brother's son. Of course, I am hurt, and I have cried over it for days, but the reason I don't want any contact with Henry is because I no longer want Karen in my life. If I talk to her child, she will find a way to snake her way into my life again, and I need my own space. You can call me cruel or selfish, but I can't see him ever again. Or at least not for a very long time. Update 2. Most of you have correctly guessed that it was in fact my mother who told Kyle about my dad changing his will, and he called me as a last resort to mend things. I did confront her in front of my dad and she broke down. She told me how I had punished Kyle enough and that he had learned his lesson. My dad firmly told my mother that if she felt what Kyle did was forgivable, then he could no longer stay married to her, since he could never forgive him for this betrayal. His threat seemed to shut my mother up. My dad made it clear to her that if she ever talked with Kyle and we found out, then she could pack her bags and leave him. Like I said, my dad is a very stubborn guy. Hopefully, my mother will learn from her mistakes. Update 3. Hi, Reddit. It's been 5 months since my last update. My relationship with my parents has improved in the last couple of months. My dad and I go golfing every weekend, and he behaves with me more like a buddy than my own father. My mother, even though she misses Kyle, has stayed away from him. The last I heard about Kyle was from my cousin, who told me how Kyle had been asking everyone for money and, in the end, had to drop out of college when he could not afford to pay his fees anymore. He and Karen are living together, and he even has a job as a part-time mechanic. Apparently, they are raising Henry together, which is a good thing, I guess. I never bring up Kyle in my discussions with my parents, and neither do they. For everyone asking, I am doing quite well. I was promoted at my job 2 months ago, so my salary has improved significantly. I haven't been dating anyone since I feel like I still need time and space to heal. I've been going to a few therapy sessions, so I guess we will see how that works out.